When veteran Genshin players look back fondly on the first nation they visit, they feel a sense of peace and nostalgia. Mondstadt reminds us of a simpler time when the story felt easy to process and the place gave or still gives you a sense of home compared to all the forbidden knowledge and dissolution stuff we have nowadays. However, because of this, people tend to recall the Archon Quest prologue featuring this nation to consist of overly basic storytelling, citing that all we did was fight a dragon, which, what an oversimplified way of describing this quest. Is that really all you remember from it? Damn, you'd better not write movie summaries on IMDb if that's the case. Anyway, my point is, while I do understand why fans would consider Mondstadt's story to be too simple, I'd like to remind you of some of its intricacies and complexities that made it memorable and thought-provoking despite the lack of heavy lore incorporated into it. If you find this kind of analysis interesting, I hope you could consider subscribing to the channel to catch content like this in the near future. As you know already, Genshin's storyline is structured with each Archon quest having its own plot, which fits into an overarching plot about the traveler finding their sibling and discovering the truth about Tevat, then possibly saving it. Each Archon quest is supposed to give us information for what the future would look like, so although each nation's story can be taken on its own, it's also important to consider how it fits into the bigger picture. With that, Mondstadt's Archon quest is given the tough task of both easing us into the story while setting up plot points that may recur or be referenced in the future. So it has to be both informative and easy to follow. What's trickier about this task is that the future presents us with two factions of antagonists and two important historical time points, both of which Mondstadt has to introduce to us already. To start off with the dual antagonists, we now recognize them as both the Abyss and the Fatui, who are really quite interesting because now we get a sense that they may have similar goals with possibly confronting Celestia, yet they have different means through which they strive to achieve their end goals, and they both also put pressure on a nation in two distinct ways. The Abyss represents a sort of magical or calamital threat, where solving it requires either brute force, magic, or divine intervention. Meanwhile, the Fatui poses a political threat which undermines a nation's sovereignty and independence, as well as sows discord in order to gain a grip on its government and have that country at its mercy. Usually, Fatui threats need more strategic and diplomatic approaches to address. These two forces contrast the ideals of the traveler as well as the governments of nations other than Snezhnaya, and overcoming them becomes a recurring struggle over time due to their evolving ways of meddling with the lives of Tevat citizens. However, not all Archon quests require the active use of these two antagonists. Liyue and Inazuma focus more on political threats through the Fatui and their conspirators within the country, while Fontaine focuses almost solely on the calamital threat, with the political antagonism being there but still rather light compared to other nations. Sumeru balances out these threats with how we foil the Fatui's plan to create a new god, while also addressing the spread of forbidden knowledge. Mondstadt, however, seemed to be required to present both factions at the start for a proper introduction, and they handle it pretty well, I would say. On the side of the Abyss, they let you know pretty early on that they're not just brainless monsters but achieve their goals through tactical coordination and manipulation with dark magic, as exemplified by their influence on Dvalin. Meanwhile, the Fatui are shown to be coercive in their provision of a violent solution to the Storm Terror crisis, hinting at their lack of respect for local customs and their desire to have nations indebted to them for the quote-unquote help. It's really interesting to see how both factions plan to wreak havoc in their own ways through the use of this dragon, rather than just acting on their own separately. Instead of showing the Abyss mages just command hilichurls to ransack the city, or the Fatui making a predatory diplomatic deal separately, both of their ill intentions manifest through the same problem, which is through Dvalin storms. And that way the plot becomes very streamlined while helping us become acquainted with two different factions at once. Plus, it makes the dragon slaying concept seem more complex than your usual tales that fall under this trope. It all boils down to their strategies to directly harm an Archon as a way of harming their worshippers as well, demonstrating how intertwined a nation is with their Archon despite them not being physically present anymore. It sets the stage for what we can expect both factions to do in the future, even while keeping their motives mysterious. Aside from needing to introduce the two main recurring antagonistic factions of the game, Mondstadt was also tasked with making us acquainted with two important eras in history that we would need to be familiar with while journeying through the succeeding nations, as both these eras changed what life on Teyvat looked like. These are the Archon War and the Cataclysm, which were worldwide events that manifested differently in each nation. To be fair, it's not like Mondstadt introduced those terms right away, but Venti did hint at how they occurred in their national context. The mentions of Old Mondstadt and its tyrant ruler are a reference to the overthrowing of the Caribbean, which occurred during the Archon War, and the Valen's fight with Durin, which was retold in the Archon Quest prologue, happened during the Cataclysm. Although the Archon War and the Cataclysm were not directly mentioned, our knowledge of Venti's tales were aligned with these major events later on. In fact, it was probably a good thing that the game didn't mention the exact terms early on, since it helps to ease us into the story, and it also makes sense for the traveler to take time piecing their knowledge of those two major events. What's important is that we had a vague idea of the history of Teyvat early on, and we got a sense that lots of the main story of Genshin Impact involves recounting history. Establishing that early on proved to be quite successful in my opinion. Speaking of recounting history and clarifying some misconceptions about certain past events, it's quite convenient that in the first nation we journey through, we encounter a bard that explains everything to us in a comprehensive yet simple way. It's bards like these that keep Mondstadt historically conscious through their storytelling prowess. However, despite the convenience of having our first Archon take the form of Venti the Bard for exposition's sake, I realized that introducing the concept of Archons with him may have been quite challenging, yet they still executed it well. Among the Archons, Barbatos is an exception in terms of him not having a recognizable presence among citizens, choosing instead to guide them from the sidelines. Typically, you would attempt to introduce the rule before bringing up exceptions to it, but when it comes to Archons, we were shown the exception first. Pretty interesting, I'd say. Thus, it put forth the idea that people's faith in their Archon matters more than their actual presence, although it also raised issues about the limitations to which mortals can truly discern the will of their Archon, a theme that ended up becoming a recurring one across nations. That's not to say that introducing Archonship through Venti was extremely difficult, and some people probably predicted early on that he was the Animo Archon already, but progressing through the story, not having an idea about the Archon, unless you were spoiled like I was, must have been such a unique experience compared to the other nations. Aside from that, Venti is an Archon with lots of history attached to him, more than other Archons aside from Zhongli, considering they're both part of the original 7. However, while the other Archons' experiences during the Cataclysm and/or the Archon War were described to us, Venti went through an additional major event in the form of the revolt against the aristocracy. So instead of having around 1 to 2 important time periods, Venti had to go through 3. When you have a character, especially an Archon with such a dense backstory, you have to exercise discipline in not dumping all that information on the players right away, even though I think there might have been a level of temptation to do so. For example, Venti's experience as a wisp being conscripted into a rebellion against the Caribbean would give you a really great idea of why he'd choose to pursue freedom as the national value once he became an Archon. But the writers probably also realized that they don't need to over-explain Venti's love for freedom, since it could just be part of the set of values he holds. What they do instead is hint at the old ruler of Mondstadt being a tyrant and leave the details for another time. Then they have Jean recite Barbatos' decree, allowing Mondstadt to rule itself, focusing more on his intention and philosophy rather than overly emphasizing the backstory for that particular decision, especially since it was not necessary at that moment. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot to Venti's character in terms of backstory, history, and secrets, some of which we don't even know yet until now. But the Mondstadt Archon quest manages to present him in a concise manner. It's not that the writers oversimplified his character, but they just decided to reveal his most important traits and attitudes to get you to focus on understanding as well as critiquing his value of freedom. They know what to prioritize telling you at the given moment. Other than just balancing out the amount of information the story divulges about Barbatos, the writers also made him sufficiently well-rounded. He's both silly and very wise in an old man way, as well as both open and mysterious to certain degrees. Personifying the concept of freedom can be easily done by making a character that's, very easygoing, lighthearted, but it's one thing to possess traits that exemplify freedom, and it's another thing to possess traits that would make you a diligent guardian of freedom, since it's something that can be taken away very easily. This is where Venti comes in time and time again with his sense of wisdom to ensure that people's and even dragons' rights to exercise their free will are upheld. He's a god that knows when to exercise control and influence to appropriate degrees to preserve the national value he chose. And this is what sets our expectation for how Archons are supposed to exemplify their national values and how they contend with these ideals and strike compromises when needed. The question of what is freedom if demanded from you by a god is really quite thought-provoking and gives you an idea of what kinds of philosophical questions the succeeding Archon quests are meant to answer, mostly relating to how the national value should be best defined and updated to suit the needs of the people. Of course, it's not only Venti who has his own personal history. The Mondstadt Archon quest cast is surprisingly stacked. Like, what do you mean we have the best graduate of the academia in 200 years, a descendant of the Abyss Order's founder, and a guy who was almost captured by the Harbingers? The dedication to giving characters a dense backstory to tie into the future or to shape their current selves is phenomenal and sets the expectation for future characters as well. Yet at the same time, like with Venti, the writers exercised a level of discipline by only revealing what is necessary at that time. Although all nations have big shot characters, since it's necessary for great people to influence their respective societies, an incredible feat of Mondstadt is having the entire Archon Quest cast, save for Venti, collectively experience major social political events pre-canon without the traveler knowing the full details. Instead, players can find out what happened through the manga. That's not to say characters from other nations don't have major backstories, but those don't necessarily affect a majority of the cast, and when it does, you are told about it, such as with Callus's death in the Fontaine Archon quest. Meanwhile, Mondstadt had a riveting plot equivalent to an Archon quest of its own in the manga, referenced slightly but not forcefully dumped onto the traveler in-game. I think the way these characters sort of reference their collective past while not making the traveler confused is a testament to the writer's craft. For example, you get a sense that Diluc and Kaya have some sort of beef, but instead of making you as a player feel bad for missing out on their backstory, you're made to feel curious instead, since the character's way of beefing isn't in your face to the point that you demand a complete explanation. On the surface, their points of disagreement seem reasonable enough because it looks like Diluc just doesn't agree with how the knights do things, while Kaya remains a knight. It's a point of contention that makes a lot more sense once you get to learn about how Diluc used to be a captain of the knights and dealt with Erok, covering up the case of Diluc's father's death, plus the whole situation with Kaya's eye reveal. But it's not so bewildering that their actions don't make sense without knowing their personal history. Even Jean is a part of this conflict, with her having to investigate Erok back then, and her being the current acting Grandmaster, so you can observe her tension with Diluc as well, but he's not overly hostile to her to the point that you require them to open about it. In fact, their conversation is a great example of the way the writers hint at these characters' pasts without revealing everything. In the Asian dubs, Jean accidentally refers to Diluc as a senior like senpai or sonbe, which in these languages' cultural contexts implies that they were in the same field before. It's not that obvious in English because she called him sir, and well, who even calls the knight sir anyway? But keeping the intent in the original language, it's such a good way of building intrigue while cultivating the player's patience, ensuring that you'll find out in due time. It's no easy feat to find the right balance between revealing everything about a character and acting like nothing that happened in their past is worth caring about. It really makes them feel like real people and not just expedient plot devices. Yes, the same can be said for all the other nations, but again, Mondstadt does a good job at easing you into how they do characterization. Plus, they constantly have to resist the temptation to infodump really detailed past events from the manga during a time when it's not appropriate yet. And beyond just the events of the manga, the dialogue also subtly hints at other important character details, such as one of Kaya's introductory lines saying he understands the pain of being separated from family, linking to both his Kanrian heritage and him leaving the Dawn Winery at the very start of the game already. Then there's Lisa, who identified the ley line disorders being the source of the Valen's extra powers, building towards establishing her studies in the Spantama Darshan of the Sumeru Academia long before we even knew what Darshans were. Jeans, being the acting Grandmaster, also references the existence of Varka, the actual Grandmaster, who is out on an expedition, letting us know that we're going to encounter him sometime in the future. All of these things build towards a sense of mystery surrounding these characters that motivates us to get to know them more thoroughly through their story quests and character profiles. Heck, until this day, we are still getting to know them, especially Kaya, who bears the Alberich bloodline and is flabbergasted by his own ancestors' drama. And this is what makes Mondstadt function so well as the introductory region, because an easy way to draw people in is to make them eager to find out more about the characters alongside the world in general. So although the general arc of the Mondstadt Archon quest was simple enough, lots of the character motivations and interactions rely on rather deep foundations which seem to have been detailed greatly even before the quest was written. Mondstadt seems to start off as your typical fantasy setting. It takes place in a vaguely medieval to Renaissance European-inspired nation with knights, castles, and dragons. Except none of them actually play the roles you'd expect them to. First of all, I'd like to point out the Knights of Favonius. I had heard of Kaya before playing Genshin, and I also heard of him being a captain of the Knights of Favonius, so I assumed that he led his squads on fights against evil forces, which by all means he does, especially once he gets his horses back. But more than that, he turned out to be the sort of administrative coordinator with a considerable amount of paperwork to do. And the case is more pronounced for Jean, who does literally everything. Upon meeting Lisa, we also find out that the Knights even have non-combative members who take care of research, logistics, documents, things like that. You then realize that the Knights of Favonius essentially constitute this nation's government, completely challenging the common image of knights only fulfilling the role of defending the kingdom in battle. Having the knights characterized this way in Mondstadt's setting isn't only done to be unique for its own sake, but it also allows the nation to explore various issues of governance rather than just relying on combat strength and royal customs. This allows them to tackle diplomacy, the preservation of history, community service, rehabilitation efforts, and the like, showing us Genshin's plan to tell stories in their future nations about how governments work and how social reform can be pursued. The Knight serving as the government institution of Mondstadt not only subverts our expectation of what knights are supposed to do, but also gives us a take on medieval Europe that completely goes against expectations, which is that it involves the lack of a monarchy. Monarchy and medieval Europe were undoubtedly super intertwined in real life because of the whole ideas regarding divine right, and it was fueled by kingdoms further expanding their territories into empires, giving the king more power than he had already. And of course, the system was backed up by several tiers of nobility with their own respective privileges, while the serfs were meant to suffer from endless work for the promise of quote-unquote protection. However, since Mondstadt is the city of freedom, it wouldn't make sense for it to be ruled by royalty anymore. And the Archon's active stance against a very strictly top-down approach to governance emphasizes this point further. Later, we do learn that each nation has their own unique system of governance, which neither falls into democracies or monarchies, showcasing the creativity of Genshin writers. But choosing to start that trend in a medieval-inspired nation lets you know right away that Genshin Impact's storyline is definitely not your typical fantasy at all. Of course, these points are in praise of the world building more than the actual Archon Quest events, but these provide the key foundations for how the plot would move forward. The absence of a king or queen's decree to dictate collective action against the dragon, and the knight's hesitance to resort to violent measures to resolve the Storm Terror crisis are unique and nuanced plot points that stem from these world-building choices. As for the actual plot, like I mentioned, I think the approach to not making the dragon inherently evil and not attempting to kill it is a really good choice which subverts typical tropes of the fantasy genre. Although I will say that newer stories under the genre tend to stray away from the purely evil external threats anyway. Aside from the dragon simply being not inherently evil, fighting it was not framed as a typical heroic journey where one main protagonist leads a group into victory, but it was depicted more as an effort on the part of different sectors, from the government to even the business sector, and it was mainly a test of the Archon's ability to protect their people and avert national crises. Testing the rulership will allow players to weigh whether the Archons do really deserve their positions of power, and also invites us to consider to what degree humans should rely on their gods. It lends itself to a nuanced discussion of recognizing how much these Archons love their people and accept their duty to watch over them, while at the same time understanding that they could also just contribute to the flourishing of their respective nations from the sidelines without needing to maintain their authority. And just a side note, I think Dvalin's case was Genshin's way of possibly hinting at the struggles dragons face in Teyvat due to what seems like Celestia's colonization of it. So it's important to treat dragons well and see their full perspectives to empathize with them further when the time comes. If you think about it, the Mondstadt Archon quest is probably the reason why you're still a Genshin player up to this day. If its story was trite and boring, then there would hardly be any incentive for you to get this far into the game, sticking with it for its 5th region. Well, it could be the case that you just wanted this one character and were willing to do everything in your power just to meet them, even if that meant having to sit through hours upon hours of gameplay of something you didn't feel particularly attached to. But that seems like a rare case scenario considering how many people feel engaged by Genshin's story overall. While yes, you might find the arcs of Sumeru and Fontaine to be more complex and mind-blowing, you may not have had the opportunity to witness such exciting tales if you weren't hooked in by Mondstadt early on, especially for a non-gamer like myself who used to die from cryo slimes. I wouldn't have continued if not for the intrigue and wonder surrounding the Mondstadt storyline. More so for us lore players, I think it was Mondstadt that really helped a lot of us pursue lore investigations because of how it gave us a taste of the beautiful and intricate stories we could encounter in Teyvat. Nowadays, we are mostly motivated to continue on with the story due to a level of curiosity about the truth of Teyvat, especially with what exactly Celestia did to Khaenri'ah. But back then, I think we continued on with playing despite not knowing much about those things, yet just because of how fun Mondstadt seemed to be. And as I keep saying, we wouldn't have felt that if the story was meh. Well, yes, you have to account for me being an insane Mondstadt stan, which has probably made me more hyped about it than your average player. So if you have other thoughts in response to my assessment of Mondstadt's Archon quest, feel free to share them in the comment section below to offer your varied perspectives. Now I'm curious to know, who are your favorite Mondstadt characters? Personally, these are mine, all of whom participated in the Archon quest except for Albedo. If you found this video to be insightful, then make sure to leave a like, and if you're new around here, I hope you could consider subscribing to my channel to catch other explorations of lore like this one. And that's all for today, and stay tuned for my next long-winded ramble.